What if the disgusting American food Europeans mocked was the exact thing that made them question everything they thought they knew about America? Root beer floats look strange, smell unfamiliar, and break every safe little dessert rule at once. But one taste can turn suspicion into obsession surprisingly fast. So what else have people been wrong about from a distance? Because sometimes America does not change your mind with an argument. It changes it with one cold, foamy glass. America in a glass of root beer with a scoop of vanilla ice cream should not look revolutionary, yet for many Europeans arriving in America during the 2026 World Cup, it can feel like somebody has quietly rewritten the rules of dessert. From a distance, the combination looks almost reckless. Dark soda, thick white ice cream, foam climbing toward the rim like it has somewhere important to be. Then comes the first taste, and suddenly the joke is on everyone who assumed American food was all excess and no charm. That assumption did not appear from nowhere. European coverage of American eating habits often focuses on supersized portions, sugar, fast food, and spectacle. Those things certainly exist, but they are only one slice of a much bigger table. A root beer float reveals the part that headlines rarely capture. American food is often playful, nostalgic, generous, and completely unembarrassed about wanting people to enjoy themselves. That is where the cultural contrast becomes fascinating. In Paris, dessert culture leans toward pastry counters lined with eclairs, millefeuilles, and carefully finished tarts. In Rome, gelato is treated almost like a daily ritual, served in flavors that have been refined for generations. In Vienna, coffeehouse desserts arrive with an elegance that feels built into the furniture. America walks into that same conversation, drops vanilla ice cream into a fizzy herbal soda, hands you a straw, and somehow makes the whole thing work. There is something wonderfully American about that confidence. Root beer itself can be the biggest hurdle. Its wintergreen, vanilla, and spice-like character is unfamiliar to many Europeans, especially those who associate similar herbal notes with medicine or toothpaste. But once vanilla ice cream begins melting into it, the whole drink changes personality. The sharp edges soften, the carbonation keeps the sweetness from becoming heavy, and the foam becomes rich and creamy. What first looked like a science fair project suddenly tastes like a diner, a summer road trip, and childhood nostalgia all squeezed into one frosty mug. And root beer floats are only the opening act. That same American instinct shows up in warm apple pie with vanilla ice cream, chicken and waffles, New York cheesecake, thick milkshakes, barbecue with sweet and smoky sauces, cinnamon rolls the size of a catcher's mitt, and pancakes stacked high enough to make a European breakfast table look politely underdressed. None of these foods are trying to imitate Paris, Naples, or Copenhagen. They are doing something far more interesting, being unapologetically American. For visitors who arrived expecting America to match every grim stereotype they had heard, food can become one of the first cracks in that picture. A country described from afar as loud, excessive, and artificial suddenly feels warm, funny, generous, and surprisingly sentimental when you're sitting in a diner with a cold root beer float in front of you. Sometimes a country does not need a speech to defend itself. Sometimes it just needs one scoop of vanilla. Buffalo wings. There's a wonderfully American kind of confidence in serving food that practically comes with its own cleanup operation. Buffalo wings arrive glossy, red-orange, unapologetically messy, with a bowl of blue cheese or ranch standing nearby like emergency equipment. To visitors used to eating roast chicken with a knife and fork in London, coq au vin in Paris, or neatly plated schnitzel in Vienna, the first instinct may be to wonder why dinner suddenly requires 10 napkins and a strategy. Then the hot sauce reaches the butter. That combination explains far more about American food than the size of the portion ever could. Traditional buffalo sauce is remarkably simple. Cayenne pepper hot sauce mixed with melted butter, producing a balance that keeps pulling the tongue in two directions. The vinegar and chili wake everything up, while the butter rounds off the sharpest edges. Add salty chicken skin, cool blue cheese dressing, and crisp celery, and the plate becomes a carefully constructed cycle of heat, fat, salt, acid, and relief. The next wing tastes good partly because the previous one made you want something cool, and the cool dip immediately makes another spicy bite sound like an excellent idea. American bar food figured out the behavioral loop before smartphone apps did. The story is just as American. Buffalo wings are widely credited to Buffalo, New York, where the Anchor Bar began serving its famous version in 1964. What started as a local specialty eventually became so embedded in American sports culture that wings now function almost like edible punctuation during football season. The National Chicken Council estimated that Americans would eat about 45 billion chicken wings during Super Bowl weekend in 2024. Lined up end to end, that quantity would circle the earth more than 3 times. That is no longer merely a snack, that is infrastructure with hot sauce. Europe certainly loves chicken, but the social ritual around wings is different. In Britain, pubs are historically built around pints, pies, fish, and chips, and Sunday roasts. Germany has its sausages and beer hall staples. Spain turned shared eating into an art form through tapas. America took the communal table, added a mountain of finger food, televised sports, hot sauce, cold beer, and somehow created a meal where getting sauce on your cheek is almost evidence that you participated properly. That informality matters more than it seems. American cuisine is often judged from photographs showing towering portions, yet a picture cannot capture the social permission built into foods like buffalo wings. Nobody is expected to look elegant while eating them. People reach across the table, argue about ranch versus blue cheese, compare heat levels, steal the last drumette, and laugh when somebody discovers too late that extra hot was not decorative language. For European visitors discovering America in person, that can be unexpectedly appealing. The food is not asking them to understand a complicated tradition before joining in. It simply makes room at the table and dares everyone to grab one. Buffalo wings may look chaotic from across the Atlantic, but once the sauce is on your fingers, the logic becomes beautifully clear. America did not invent neatness here. It invented a reason to order another dozen: mac and cheese. Mac and cheese has the dangerous appearance of a food that has absolutely nothing left to prove. There is no architectural plating, no dramatic garnish, and usually no ingredient that requires a waiter to explain its childhood in Provence. It is pasta covered in cheese, served hot enough to fog your glasses, and somehow Americans have turned that almost embarrassingly simple idea into one of the most emotionally loaded comfort foods in the country. That simplicity is exactly why it becomes so easy to love. Europe certainly understands pasta and cheese, but the relationship is usually framed differently. In northern Italy, baked pasta dishes may rely on bechamel, Parmigiano Reggiano, ragu, or regional cheeses, while France has gratins where dairy is folded into a more formal cooking tradition. Britain has its own long history of macaroni cheese. Yet in the United States, the dish escaped the boundaries of a recipe and became something closer to edible reassurance. It appears at backyard cookouts, barbecue joints, family dinners, Thanksgiving tables, school cafeterias, diners, and late-night kitchens where nobody is interested in pretending a salad would solve the problem. There is chemistry behind that appeal. Pasta gives the soft starch, melted cheese contributes fat and salt, and a well-made sauce wraps everything in a texture that requires almost no effort to eat. Researchers studying food reward have long shown that combinations of fat and carbohydrates can produce especially strong responses in the brain's reward system. Mac and cheese practically arrives wearing a name tag that says, "Yes, that is the entire business model." America also has the dairy supply to support this affection. USDA food availability data show that per capita cheese availability in the United States has climbed from roughly 14 pounds a year in the mid-1970s to more than 40 pounds in recent years. That does not mean Americans spend their lives standing over a cheese drawer, although some refrigerators make a convincing case. It does show how deeply cheese has worked its way into the modern American diet. The most revealing part, however, is how flexible the dish became once Americans got hold of it. One restaurant may bake it under brown breadcrumb crust. A southern barbecue counter might serve it thick enough for the spoon to stand at attention. Another kitchen folds in smoked Gouda, sharp cheddar, jalapenos, lobster, brisket, or bacon. Even the familiar box version has its own cultural status because millions of Americans associate that bright orange bowl with childhood, college apartments, snow days, and dinners made when the adults were too tired to negotiate with anyone. That is a side of American food foreigners can miss when they only hear about fast food chains and oversized meals. Much of the country's most beloved cooking is built around comfort rather than spectacle. The serving may be generous, but generosity is not automatically excess. Sometimes it simply means somebody wants you to leave the table full. A Parisian cheese board may invite you to appreciate each cheese separately, while American mac and cheese takes several good ideas, melts the boundaries between them, and serves the result with a spoon. That difference says plenty about the country itself. America has a remarkable habit of taking food that could have remained ordinary, making it warmer, richer, easier to share, and then attaching enough memories to it that one bite can send a grown adult straight back to age 9. For a visitor, that first forkful may simply taste creamy and salty. For an American, there's often an entire childhood hiding underneath the cheese: corn dogs. Corn dogs make almost no effort to behave like serious food, and that may be exactly why they work so well. A hot dog gets wrapped in a slightly sweet cornmeal batter, dropped into hot oil, pushed onto a wooden stick, and handed over like America decided lunch should occasionally feel like winning something at a county fair. That stick matters more than it seems. In much of Europe, street food still carries a strong sense of place. Berlin has currywurst served chopped and sauced in paper trays. Brussels has fries with mayonnaise. London has sausage rolls and meat pies that can be eaten while walking, but they still belong to familiar bakery or pub traditions. The corn dog takes a different route because it was built around movement, crowds, fairs, stadiums, amusement parks, and the deeply American idea that food should sometimes be designed for one hand while the other is busy holding a ticket, a drink, or a child who suddenly wants to ride the Ferris wheel again. That practicality helped make fair food its own category in the United States. The Iowa State Fair, one of the country's best-known examples, drew more than one. 18 million visitors in 2023. The Minnesota State Fair regularly attracts around 2 million people over its run, turning a temporary fairground into something closer to a food city with livestock nearby. At that scale, food cannot be delicate or slow. It needs to travel well, survive crowds, smell good from 20 feet away, and make people want it before they have even decided they are hungry. Corn dogs are almost engineered for that environment. The batter is a major reason they become so easy to keep eating. Cornmeal gives a slightly grainy texture and a mild sweetness that regular breading does not have, while frying creates a crisp shell around the salty sausage inside. That contrast is the whole trick. Soft meets crunchy, sweet meets salty, and the wooden stick keeps the mess under control just enough to preserve dignity. It is basically a tiny piece of culinary engineering disguised as fairground chaos. Europe has plenty of sausages, of course, and arguably some of the best sausage traditions on earth. Germany alone could keep a person busy for years with bratwurst, weisswurst, bockwurst, and regional variations. What feels unusual in America is not the sausage itself, but the decision to coat it in corn batter and turn it into a portable event. That is the part outsiders often underestimate about American food culture. The country is very good at turning ordinary ingredients into experiences. A hot dog becomes a corn dog. Cheese curds get fried. Oreos somehow end up in a fryer and survive the journey with their reputation improved. Somebody looks at a stick and starts asking dangerous questions, and strangely the result rarely feels pretentious. Corn dogs are not asking to be admired with folded hands. They're asking to be eaten outside, probably while music is playing somewhere nearby, and somebody is carrying an oversized stuffed animal they absolutely did not need. That atmosphere is hard to photograph and even harder to explain from overseas. Once you're standing inside it though, the corn dog suddenly makes complete sense. America did not merely put sausage on a stick. It built an entire little celebration around it: Philly cheesesteak. A Philly cheesesteak is the kind of food that looks like somebody stopped halfway through making dinner, shoved everything into a roll, and accidentally created a city landmark. Thin slices of beef, melted cheese, and onions are packed into bread until the sandwich feels less like lunch and more like a structural engineering test. Yet the real story is not the size. It is how Philadelphia turns speed, heat, and simplicity into something people will cross neighborhoods to argue about. That last part matters because Americans do not treat the cheesesteak like a neutral object. In Philadelphia, ordering one can come with its own vocabulary, loyalties, and decades of debate over cheese, onions, bread, and which shop deserves the crown. Pat's and Gino's may be the names tourists hear first, but locals can give you a completely different list before you finish asking the question. A sandwich becomes neighborhood identity, and suddenly lunch has the emotional weight of a rivalry game. That kind of food culture can surprise visitors from Europe because the comparison is not really with fine dining. It is closer to the pride surrounding a proper doner in Berlin, a kebab shop in London, or a beloved bocadillo bar in Madrid. The difference is that Philadelphia's version leans hard into hot beef, melted cheese, and a long roll strong enough to survive the whole operation without surrendering halfway through. The texture is where the addiction begins. Cheesesteak beef is usually sliced very thin, which gives it a broad surface area for browning while keeping it tender. Onions add sweetness and moisture, while cheese fills the gaps between meat and bread, turning three ordinary components into something much richer than the ingredient list suggests. That is why the sandwich feels satisfying almost immediately. There is no waiting around for subtlety to introduce itself. Philadelphia certainly sells enough of them to prove the point. Tourism organizations have long described the cheesesteak as one of the city's signature foods, while major shops routinely move hundreds or even thousands of sandwiches on busy days. Pat's King of Steaks, which traces its origins to 1930, is often credited with helping create the modern cheesesteak tradition. Nearly a century later, people are still standing in line for a combination that is basically beef, bread, onions, and cheese. That longevity says more than any trend forecast could. American food is often at its best when it refuses to overcomplicate pleasure. The cheesesteak does not ask whether you have studied the menu properly. It arrives hot, fragrant, a little messy, and entirely committed to the idea that a sandwich should actually feel like a meal. Compare that with the daintier lunch culture found in parts of Paris, where a jambon beurre can be beautifully spare, or Copenhagen, where open-faced smørrebrød often treats presentation as part of the experience. Philadelphia takes the opposite route. It loads the roll until gravity gets involved, and somehow That is exactly the charm. For visitors who expected American cuisine to be nothing more than chains and excess, a real cheesesteak can reset the conversation. This is not food invented by a marketing department. It is local, stubborn, practical, and tied tightly to one city's personality. Philadelphia did not just make a sandwich people remember. It made one people are willing to argue about for generations: chicken and waffles. There's a moment when European breakfast logic runs straight into American dinner logic, and both somehow leave the collision better off. That moment is chicken and waffles. One half of the plate says Sunday brunch, with a golden waffle ready for butter and maple syrup. The other half looks like it just walked out of a southern kitchen wearing a coat of crackling fried chicken. Putting them together sounds like somebody misread two separate orders, right up until sweet syrup reaches salty, crunchy chicken. Then the argument becomes considerably harder to win. The appeal of chicken and waffles comes from a very specific American talent: refusing to keep sweet and savory foods in separate lanes. That may feel unusual to visitors from places where breakfast traditions draw clearer boundaries. A typical French breakfast might revolve around bread, butter, jam, pastries, and coffee. In Spain, toast with tomato and olive oil is common, while Britain has its famous full English breakfast, which is strongly savory despite the occasional appearance of sauces or baked beans. America looks at those boundaries and treats them more like suggestions written in pencil. Chicken and waffles pushes that freedom unusually far, yet the flavor combination is surprisingly calculated. Fried chicken brings salt, fat, seasoning, and a brittle crust. The waffle catches butter and syrup inside dozens of tiny squares, which may be the most efficient syrup delivery system ever disguised as geometry. Maple sweetness then lands against salty chicken, while the waffle softens the intensity of the fried coating. Every bite keeps changing depending on how much chicken, waffle, butter, or syrup reaches the fork. There's also real history beneath the novelty. Food historians trace different versions of chicken and waffles through several American traditions, including Pennsylvania Dutch cooking and Black American culinary history. The version many people recognize today became particularly associated with Harlem during the 20th century, where restaurants such as Wells Supper Club helped popularize fried chicken served with waffles among the late-night diners and performers. That history explains why reducing the dish to crazy American food misses the interesting part entirely. It is a product of cultures meeting, recipes moving, and Americans doing what American kitchens have repeatedly done well: borrowing influences, adapting them locally, and eventually creating something with an identity of its own. The modern brunch boom gave that tradition an enormous new stage. According to the National Restaurant Association, breakfast and brunch have remained important restaurant occasions in the United States, while fried chicken itself has become one of the country's most enduring menu staples. Put the two together and you get a plate that can comfortably appear at a neighborhood diner, a southern restaurant, or an upscale brunch spot charging enough to make your grandfather ask whether the waffle comes with a car. Yet price is not what makes people remember it. It is the permission built into the dish. Chicken and waffles tells you that breakfast does not have to behave like breakfast, syrup does not have to stay away from dinner, and a meal does not become less legitimate because somebody had fun inventing it. That attitude runs through American cooking, where regional traditions are constantly colliding and producing combinations that look questionable on paper, but become dangerously convincing on the fork. For European visitors discovering American food beyond the stereotypes, that freedom can be one of its most lovable qualities. American cuisine is not always interested in protecting boundaries simply because they have existed for a long time. Sometimes it asks a much friendlier question: what happens if these two delicious things meet? Chicken and waffles already knows the answer. You reach for another bite before deciding which side won. New York cheesecake. New York cheesecake has the confidence of a city that has already decided you are going to remember it. There's no colorful fruit tower trying to distract the eye, no decorative sugar sculpture leaning dramatically over the plate, and no need for a pastry chef to perform a small magic trick before dessert begins. The slice simply arrives thick, pale, dense, and unapologetically rich, with the kind of weight that makes a fork feel suddenly employed full-time. That density is the whole point. European cheesecakes can be remarkably different depending on where you travel. Germany's Käsekuchen is often made with quark, giving it a lighter, tangier texture. Polish Sernik traditionally uses twaróg, which produces a firmer and more textured filling. In parts of Italy, ricotta-based cheesecakes can feel softer and less intensely creamy. New York cheesecake goes in another direction entirely because cream cheese sits at the center of the experience, creating a smooth, rich filling that almost melts while still holding its shape. That American ingredient changed everything. Philadelphia cream cheese, despite the name, was developed in New York State in the 19th century, and commercial cream cheese helped create the texture modern Americans now associate with cheesecake. According to USDA dairy data, cream cheese remains a major part of the American cheese market, while cheesecake has become so common that it appears everywhere from neighborhood diners to national restaurant chains and high-end bakeries. But the fascinating part is why such a heavy dessert rarely feels boring after 3 bites. Fat carries flavor extremely well, while sugar softens the tang of cultured dairy. Eggs give the filling structure, and a graham cracker crust introduces a dry, slightly toasted crunch that prevents every bite from becoming one uninterrupted wave of creaminess. The contrast is subtle, but important. A well-made New York cheesecake does not need 12 competing flavors because the pleasure comes from texture, temperature, and richness, working in balance. That restraint is surprisingly American. People overseas sometimes picture American desserts as towers of candy, frosting, syrup, and whatever else was apparently standing nearby when the chef lost adult supervision. New York cheesecake quietly ruins that stereotype. At its best, it is almost minimal. Cream cheese, sugar, eggs, perhaps sour cream, vanilla, and a crust. The drama comes from intensity rather than clutter. And nowhere does that make more sense than New York. This is a city famous for moving quickly, talking loudly, and turning simple foods into deeply personal institutions. Pizza gets neighborhood loyalties. Bagels become a morning philosophy. Cheesecake enters the same ecosystem and somehow becomes serious enough that people will debate Juniors, Venieros, Eileen's, and old-school deli versions as if zoning laws depend on the outcome. For a European visitor, that seriousness can be funny at first. Vienna has Sachertorte wrapped in imperial history, Paris has pastry shops where technique can feel almost ceremonial, and Lisbon has pasté de nata with centuries behind them. New York offers a massive wedge of cream cheese filling and says, with remarkable confidence, "Try this before forming an opinion." Then the fork goes in. That first bite explains why the dessert became a classic. It is cool, tangy, sweet, dense enough to feel luxurious, yet familiar enough to be comforting. There is no performance required and no complicated etiquette attached to it. You simply sit down, take your time, and realize that a slice which looked almost too rich has somehow become dangerously easy to finish. New York is often accused of doing everything too much. Its cheesecake may be the sweetest evidence that sometimes too much is exactly the correct amount. America is easy to judge from a headline, but much harder to reduce once you have tasted it, talked to people, and lived inside its everyday rhythms. Sometimes a root beer float, a cheesesteak, or a plate of chicken and waffles can reveal more than 1,000 arguments ever could. So which American food would you put in front of a skeptical European first? Tell us below, and subscribe to the channel for more moments when real America surprises the people who thought they already knew it.